lots of options in second base.
Now, sleepers could be anyone from guys who are going to make a big impact on your roster, guys who are high upside guys. And I think we kind of went in a few different directions with this. You had a few guys that were both. My guys were more strictly like, hey, I'm looking for high upside, straight up. Like these guys something could click for them, but you might not get anything out of them. Who are you looking at as far as sleepers in the draft? And like I said, it ranges between guys who for their ADP are going to give you more value than what you're drafting, or also guys who you might pick them up off waivers a week into the season and they might give you value period or have a really high upside. So who are you looking at?
Yeah, I think the way that I interpret sleepers is guys that you typically pick up towards the end of the draft, or maybe your last pick, or they're on waiver wires right when you start the season. But it just takes one little thing for them to really explode up boards. My first one is Nolan Gorman. Now he has like prodigious power. Like the guy could be hitting 30, 35 home runs, which is huge at second base. I mean, it's just massive power that the guy has, but his one big problem is a 32% strikeout rate. And it just makes him a streaky hitter. So if he's able to, whatever the tweak is that he needs to get there, I see it in him. He's only 23 years old, so he's still got plenty of time to kind of adjust. If he's able to figure that out, I see him as a top 100 pick next year. And so he's going currently in my NFBC at 191. If things click for him this year, he's going to be in the top 100 next year. I think Nolan Gorman is a sleeper by the definition I kind of made up in my head. And I think that kind of works for everyone else. Another one that I mentioned is Luis Rengifo. I talked about him a few moments ago. The quad eligibility is huge. And he's a guy that I'm not crazy about the Angels, right? I think we tend to avoid guys on bad teams. But not only does the quad eligibility kind of nullify that for me, but his power took a big step forward last year, and he had an EV of 89.1 miles per hour. He's a great hitter. He's not going to get you, 25 home runs, but he's going to chip in a little bit of speed. Hit tool is okay. He's a guy, he's just going so late that I kind of can't ignore the fact of his quad eligibility, and he's going to play every day, right? The Angels aren't good enough to knock him. They don't really have anyone coming up in the system that's going to challenge him. So he should get 600 plate appearances. He should play every day and play in different positions and keep that eligibility. So hopefully that leads to some accumulation of 80 runs or RBIs, approaching 90, and good average, 15, 20 home runs, couple steals. I think that's a great value at pick 256.
When you look at eligibility, is it okay to look at, okay, this guy would be really valuable as a second baseman, but if I'm drafting him as an outfielder, he's less valuable, or vice versa? Is that something that you think about when you look at that eligibility? Because eligibility, certainly, and we talked about this, is great. You want it because for a few reasons. One that you just mentioned is that he's going to get more plate appearances. And obviously, like we talked about, you can move him around and figure out your roster around him a lot easier. But sometimes a guy could be great for shortstop, but his numbers for a second baseman, which is a much deeper position than shortstop, all of a sudden his numbers fall off. How do you look at that when you're drafting?
Yeah, I think it depends, especially because when you get this late in the draft, you already have, 90% of your team set up. I think it depends on if you have a weakness in any of those spots. So if I picked Royce Lewis early in the draft and I'm kind of worried, okay, if he does get injured again or has to miss a few weeks, who's a good stopgap for him? Or, even if I took Royce Lewis and another outfielder who I may be hesitant on, Luis Rengifo or these dual eligible, triple, quad eligible guys makes so much sense because you can slide them in. And so when I'm paying attention to that, I'm paying attention to how have I already drafted and what holes might I need to fill. And so that's kind of the first thing I attack once I look at my bench.
All right, keep going with a couple more sleepers here. So go ahead.
Yeah, I'll only do one more. I do want to touch on Gavin Lux. I think Gavin Lux could be a sleeper, but the one that I am kind of excited for is Jorge Palano going to Seattle. He's currently going at 266, which is kind of surprising to me because the guy's got great power. Like, I think he could hit. I mean, so he hit 33 home runs in 2021, kept it up in 2022. So I could definitely see him hitting 30 home runs in Seattle. I mean, I know that it's a terrible ballpark, so that plays a part, and he's not going to steal a whole lot. But when you're talking at pick 266, why not take a gamble on somebody who's got some power? Because again, if I miss the boat on some of these high end second basemen, Jorge Polanco is one that could definitely jump up 100, 120 picks by this time next year if he's able to stay healthy, because he's got 30 homer pop and he's going to hit the ball well. It's not like he strikes out at a huge clip. Let's see, his worst is 25%. So he's got a good hit tool. He's got some power. I don't see why you wouldn't take a shot on him at 266. Clearly, the Mariners thought that they had something with him. All he's got to do is stay healthy, and he's a star.
All right. You mentioned Gavin Lux for a second. I just want to point out it's the same thing. You want guys who are on good teams, right?
Yeah.
And a guy who's not going to have a lot on him. And it's like, hey, you're just going to be plugged into this lineup in middle of the lineup, or even if it's the back end of the lineup, and that can help you. Now, for me, I have a couple of guys. One, who is a sleeper for me, is a guy who is finally going to get full-time playing time on a bad team. And we talked about staying away from guys on a bad team, but this is different for me because he would be a guy that, like I said, is a waiver wire pickup or last pick in the draft, something where this guy's probably not getting drafted in a lot of leagues. And all of a sudden you can pick him up and you're seeing consistent, you get 500, 600 at bats out of him. And actually, when you look at his numbers, they're not that bad. He could hit maybe 15 home runs and bat 270 and also steal 20 bases. So that's Luis Garcia from the Washington Nationals. He could all of a sudden turn into that guy that you want. He's not a great team, but he's going to play there every day. And so that's a pick where if you get anything out of him and you took him on the waiver wires and all of a sudden you're getting some value out of him, to me, that's a huge plus. Anything would be a huge bonus. So that's like a heavy sleeper. And another guy, and we talked about this a little bit before we got on, and the one issue with him is his playing time. So it's almost the opposite of Luis Garcia, is Jonathan India. There's a lot of guys there in Cincinnati, but he's a guy who's shown flashes, and much like Gleyber Torres, in a different way, has had stretches where he's been really good, but has been inconsistent. If he going into an age 24, 25 season, where that's the age where you put it all together, if he can put it all together, he can be a really good player and leave Cincinnati no choice with like, hey, you have to play this guy because he's been that good.
Yeah, he's actually, I want to say he's going into his 27, 28, but oh, I see what you're saying. I'm sorry. I think I misunderstood. When he was 24, 25.
Yep.
Yeah. I think that's a great call out. And all it takes is one injury for him to get back to full playing time. The Reds just signed him to a 2-year deal, so he's staying there for the foreseeable future. It doesn't look like there's going to be a trade of any sort. So I think that's a good call out. We just hope that he gets the playing time, because if he only ends up with 400 at bats, it's going to hurt. But if he gets close to 600, he's going to be a steal. So it's kind of it's a tough balance of how much do you think he's going to get, and I think that risk is baked into the price currently at was it 211? I want to say, where did he go? Yeah, 221. So I think that's a good pick.
Yeah, and when you mention a guy getting traded, talk about second base, because it's so deep right now in fantasy that when you look across the league in Major League Baseball, sometimes you want to look at a guy who has the potential to get traded to a great team halfway through the season. And Jonathan India would be a perfect candidate, right? On a pretty palatable contract. If there's a team in dire need, a team that's in a pennant run, and they think, oh, we're a second baseman away and Cincinnati's not doing anything. But when you look across the league, and there's about all the top teams seem to have a really good second baseman, that doesn't really exist so much, does it?
Yeah, I mean, the alternative is then he gets traded to a really bad team, but then he plays every day, right? And so it's just kind of this weird balance of, do you want a guy who's not going to play every day on a really good team, or a guy who's going to play every day on a bad team? And obviously there's so many variables that get played into that. But I don't think he's going anywhere, but we've seen some crazy trades happen, so I'm not going to speculate one way or another. But if it's me, I'm saying grab Jonathan India at that price.
When you see a position this deep, do you generally stay away and say, okay, I can get guys later? Or is this a position you're jumping on where you're like, hey, I still want the top guys?
So that's a great question. I think it does depend. And I've talked about this a few times with friends and just in other episodes with on my other shows. It depends for me on the tiers. So like, if I end up, let's just say, so Mookie Betts is going pick 5. If I end up with the 10th overall pick and Mookie Betts is still there for some reason, I'm taking him every time, right? So it's hard to say that I'm going to avoid a position or not avoid a position. I think it depends on how the draft falls and if I can get one of the last guys in a tier and, he's just been sitting on the board too long. Like if I'm at pick 40 and Marcus Semion's still there, I'm taking him, right? And so it's hard to say I'm going to avoid the position, but if this is one that you don't find yourself getting a whole lot of shares of, if you don't end up with a second baseman by pick 150, I'm not too worried because there's quite a few guys later in this draft that are going to bring some value and have sleeper upside. Nolan Gorman's one. Edar Julian's another one that's going to pop off, I think, and have a terrific year. Again, OBP league, he's moves up probably 50 picks for me. Jorge Palano, like there's tons of guys down there who bring value. So I want a second baseman because I think it is typically a tougher position, but if I don't end up with one, I'm not going to hit the panic button.